Show more 20:48. The silence was the first thing rescuers noticed when they arrived at Ashford Springs on that cold November morning. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping town, but something else entirely. Something wrong. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and your heart beat faster. Because this wasn't supposed to be a ghost town. Just yesterday, 300 people had called this place home. Ashford Springs sat nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges, far enough from the highway that most travelers never knew it existed. For nearly a century, it had been a modest mining community, then a logging town, and finally just a quiet place where people lived simple lives. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night football game at the high school. But on the morning of November 14th, everything changed. Sheriff Tom Bradley received the first call at 6:30 in the morning. It was from a truck driver named Ray Morrison who made deliveries to Ashford Springs every Tuesday and Thursday. Ray's voice shook as he spoke into his cell phone, standing at the edge of town near the welcome sign that read Ashford Springs, population 312. Sheriff, something's happened here. I've been driving through Main Street for 10 minutes, and I haven't seen a single person. Not one. Every building is empty. Cars are parked everywhere, some with the engines still running, but there's nobody here. Tom had known Ray for 15 years. The man wasn't the type to panic or make things up. Still, the sheriff's first thought was that Ray had gotten the day wrong, or maybe there was some town event he'd forgotten about. But when he tried calling the Ashford Springs police station, the phone rang and rang with no answer. He tried the diner, the general store, the school. Nothing. By 8 o'clock, Tom was driving the 40 miles to Ashford Springs himself, accompanied by 2 deputies. The roads were clear, the morning sky bright and cold. Everything seemed normal until they crossed the town line. The welcome sign stood as it always had, slightly crooked from where a teenager had hit it with their car 2 summers ago. Beyond it, Main Street stretched out quiet and still. But it wasn't empty. Cars lined both sides of the road. The traffic light at the main intersection blinked red, then green, then yellow, performing its usual dance for an audience that had disappeared. Tom pulled his patrol car to a stop in front of Miller's Diner. Through the windows, he could see coffee cups on tables, some still steaming. A plate of eggs and bacon sat at the counter, the food fresh enough that it hadn't even begun to cool. The cash register was open, bills and coins sorted neatly in their compartments. But no one was there. Deputy Sarah Chun was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Where did they go? They split up to search the town, maintaining radio contact. Tom took Main Street, walking from building to building. The hardware store had its lights on, tools laid out on the counter as if someone had been in the middle of helping a customer. The library's front door stood propped open with a brick, the way old Mrs. Henderson always kept it on nice mornings. Books set on tables where readers had left them, some open to pages mid-chapter. At the elementary school, Tom found classroom after classroom of empty desks. A math lesson was written on one blackboard, the chalk still sitting in the tray. Small coats hung on hooks in the hallway, backpacks tucked underneath. In the cafeteria, trays of food sat ready to be served for lunch, though it was still morning. Someone had been preparing early. The church stood with its doors wide open. Hymnals lay open in the pews. Fresh flowers decorated the altar. In the small office behind the sanctuary, Tom found a half-written sermon on the pastor's desk, the pen resting on the paper as if Reverend Marcus had simply stood up mid-sentence and walked away. Deputy Chun called in from the residential area on the east side of town. Sheriff, you need to see this. I'm at the Morrison house on Elm Street. Tom drove over to find Sarah standing in the front yard of a modest 2-story home. She led him inside without a word. In the kitchen, the table was set for breakfast. For plates, for glasses of orange juice, for sets of silverware. A pan of scrambled eggs sat on the stove, the burner still on low. Upstairs, beds were made in 2 of the rooms and unmade in the others. The shower in the main bathroom was still damp, A towel hung hastily on the rack. "It's like this everywhere I've checked," Sarah said. People were in the middle of their normal routines and then just vanished. The third deputy, Marcus Webb, had been checking the outskirts of town. His report was the same. Houses stood occupied, but empty. The gas station had a car at the pump, the nozzle still in the tank, fuel having overflowed onto the ground before the automatic shutoff kicked in. At the town's small medical clinic, patient files were pulled and waiting in examination rooms, but Dr. Patel and his nurse were nowhere to be found. By noon, Tom had called in state police and the FBI. By evening, Ashford Springs was swarming with investigators, journalists being held at a perimeter 2 miles out, and helicopters circling overhead. The story spread quickly. A town of 300 people had simply disappeared without a trace, all at roughly the same time on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The investigation consumed weeks. Forensic teams swept every building, every vehicle, every inch of ground. They found no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no indication of mass panic. People's belongings remained untouched. Wallets with cash and credit cards sat on dressers. Jewelry lay in boxes. Cars had keys in the ignition. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. The people were simply gone. Federal investigators interviewed everyone they could find who had any connection to Ashford Springs. Families of the vanished pleaded for answers on national television. Theories multiplied and spread across the internet like wildfire. Some claimed it was a government experiment gone wrong. Others insisted it was aliens. Religious groups declared it was the rapture, though they couldn't explain why it would happen to one small town and nowhere else. Skeptics suggested an elaborate hoax, though they couldn't explain how 300 people could coordinate such a thing or why they would want to. Tom Bradley became the face of the investigation, giving press conferences where he had to admit again and again that they had no answers. The weight of it aged him. He'd known many of the missing people personally. Jack Henderson, who ran the hardware store, had helped Tom build a deck on his house 3 summers ago. Emma Yates, the librarian, had recommended books to his daughter throughout her childhood. Reverend Marcus had officiated Tom's wedding 20 years earlier. 6 months into the investigation, a team of geologists discovered something unusual. Deep beneath Ashford Springs, nearly 2 miles down, the earth showed signs of ancient cave systems that had never been properly mapped. The rock formations were strange, containing mineral combinations that the geologists had never seen before. Some of the crystals they extracted from core samples seemed to emit a faint energy that their instruments couldn't quite classify. Dr. Rachel Kim, a physicist brought in to study the samples, spent 3 months running tests. She discovered that the crystals appeared to interact with electromagnetic fields in unexpected ways. Under certain conditions, they created what she called localized distortions in the space around them. But when pressed to explain what that meant or how it related to the disappearances, she could only say that she needed more time, more research, more data. The town remained frozen in time, a museum of normal life interrupted. The government eventually declared it a closed investigation scene, though they never officially shut it down. Guards were posted at the perimeter. Scientists came and went. Years passed. Tom Bradley retired from law enforcement, unable to shake the weight of what he'd witnessed. He wrote a book about the disappearances, not for profit, but because he felt the missing deserved to have their story told. He titled it The Silence of Ashford Springs. In the book, he described each of the missing people he'd known. There was 10-year-old Sophie Chun, who'd won the school spelling bee 3 years running. Marcus Webb's cousin Daniel, a mechanic who could fix any engine and play guitar at the town summer concerts. The Kowalski family, who'd moved to Ashford Springs just a year before the disappearance, hoping for a quieter life for their 3 children. Maria Santos, who ran the bakery and whose cinnamon rolls were legendary. Old Mr. Patterson, who sat on the same bench in the town square every afternoon, feeding pigeons and chatting with anyone who passed by. 300 lives, each with their own stories, their own dreams, their own ordinary beauties and struggles. All gone in a moment. 10 years after the disappearances, Tom received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, weathered and creased as if it had traveled a long distance. The image showed a group of people standing in what looked like a vast underground cavern. The walls glittered with the same strange crystals the geologists had found beneath Ashford Springs. The people in the photo were too far away and the image too grainy to identify anyone clearly, but something about the way they stood, the way they gathered together, reminded Tom of a community. He studied that photograph for hours, then days, then weeks. He showed it to former FBI agents who'd worked the case, to the families of the missing, to Dr. Kim and her team of scientists. Some thought it was a cruel hoax. Others saw it as proof that the missing were still alive somewhere. Tom didn't know what to believe. On the 11th anniversary of the disappearance, Tom drove back to Ashford Springs. The guards knew him and let him through without question. The town looked the same as it had that first morning, preserved by government order and the dry mountain air. He walked down Main Street as the sun set, his footsteps echoing in the empty silence. He stopped in front of Miller's Diner, peering through the window at tables that hadn't been disturbed in over a decade. He thought about all the mornings he'd eaten breakfast there, all the conversations he'd had with people who are now gone. The loss felt as fresh as it had 11 years ago. As darkness fell, Tom sat on the bench where Mr. Patterson used to feed the pigeons. The town square was empty, the fountain long since run dry. Stars emerged overhead, bright and clear in the mountain sky. Tom looked up at them and wondered if somewhere, somehow, 300 people were looking at the same stars and thinking of the home they'd left behind. Or perhaps they'd found a new home, someplace strange and impossible, someplace that human understanding couldn't quite grasp. Perhaps the earth itself had opened and swallowed them, not in violence, but in mystery. Perhaps they'd stumbled through some crack in reality that no one could explain or replicate. Tom didn't have answers. After 11 years of investigation, countless theories, and endless questions, he'd learned to accept that some mysteries might never be solved. Ashford Springs would remain frozen as a monument to the unknown, a reminder that for all humanity's knowledge and technology, the universe still held secrets beyond comprehension. He stood up from the bench as the moon rose over the eastern mountains. Before leaving, he walked to the small cemetery on the edge of town. The government had erected a memorial there, a simple granite stone listing the names of all 300 missing people. Tom placed his hand on the cold surface and whispered a quiet goodbye to the town he'd tried so hard to save. As he drove away that night, the lights of Ashford Springs fading in his rearview mirror, Tom thought about the photograph tucked in a jacket pocket. He didn't know if those distant figures were really the missing people of Ashford Springs. He didn't know if they were alive or dead, nearby or impossibly far away. But he chose to believe they were somewhere, together, still the community they'd always been. The highway stretched out before him, leading back to a world that had moved on from the mystery of Ashford Springs. But Tom knew that the families left behind had never truly moved on. Every birthday, every holiday, every quiet moment brought fresh reminders of those who were missing. 300 empty chairs at 300 dinner tables. 300 voices silenced in a single morning. The ghost town remained as it had been found, a snapshot of ordinary life interrupted by the extraordinary. Coffee cups and breakfast plates, half-written sermons, and unfinished lessons. Lives paused mid-step and never resumed. Somewhere in the darkness beneath the mountains, strange crystals pulsed with energy that science couldn't fully explain. And somewhere, in a place no one could find, 300 people existed in memory and mystery, forever caught between what was known and what would never be understood. The case of Ashford Springs stayed officially open, though no investigators actively worked it anymore. The town stood empty and silent, waiting for answers that might never come, guarded by mountains and mystery and the passage of time that slowly turned tragedy into legend. And in the hearts of those who remembered, hope and sorrow existed side by side, sustained by the faint possibility that one day, somehow, the silence might finally be broken and the truth revealed. But until that day came, if it ever did, Ashford Springs remained exactly as it had been found that cold November morning, a place where 300 people had vanished overnight, leaving behind only questions and the haunting echo of lives interrupted.